Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we are going to introduce you to a new part of the animation blueprint called a state machine, very useful part of it. And what it'll allow us to do is if we hit a Boolean switch here, it's going to allow us to transition into a jumping state and then back down to grounded. Let's see how all of this works and how we can create this for ourselves. Okay, so we've got this really weird behavior when we jump, which just means that we end up running in midair, which is obviously not a very good look. Now, to fix this, we're going to need to learn about a whole new animation concept called an animation state machine. So this belongs in the animation blueprint, so go ahead and get that fired up if you haven't got it fired up already. And over in the anim graph, so far, everything we've done in the anim graph has been through these nodes here. Now, what I want to show you is how we can add something new, something called a state machine. We're going to right-click, and this is in the anim graph, and we're going to look for state machine, and you can see that this add new state machine is one option here. Now, I want to show you that there's another way of doing this as well. If you right-click all the way back, so if we right-click in the anim graph and search for new state machine, then we've got this option here. If we click it, creates a new node, and you can see that node has a single animation pose output pin. And over in the left-hand pane in the My Blueprint, it's created this new state machine underneath our anim graph. So if you either double-click on the new state machine or click it over in the anim graph, you see it takes you to this new window. So it's yet another thing. We've got our anim graph, our event graph, and now we've got this state machine graph. We can actually rename that, so we can give our state machine a better name by clicking it in the My Blueprint and hitting F2, and we can call it locomotion, because this is going to be all about locomotion. And then what does a state machine do? Well, a state machine is, at its simplest, it's a set of, if you right-click, in fact, you can see there's a couple of options here. There's a comment, there's a conduit, but the most important thing is states. It is a machine full of states, and I can add a couple of states in here to give you an idea. So we've got state 1, state 2. And then if you drag off of this border, it creates something called a transition. So we can create a transition between states. And we've got this entry pin, which basically is telling us which state should we start in. Okay, so let's take a little step back. What does this all mean? Well, in each given state, if you double click on it, you can see that there's an output pin, and that output pin can be used in the same way as our anim graph can be used to build up an animation pose. So in its simplest form, we might just decide to stick an animation in here. So select any old animation, playability E, for example, and that's the animation that's going to be played when the state machine is in a given state. Now, how do we get into a given state? Well, we might get into a given state because our entry node points to it, and so that's the default state. That's where we start off. But then we might get to a state via a series of transitions as well. So the transitions each have properties. You can double-click on a transition, and you can see that, again, we get this node editor pop up, and we can have some sort of Boolean property. So, I don't know, we could have something like is dead. We can get is dead, we can pipe that into here. And now every time is dead is true, we're going to make the transition. If we're in this original state, if we are dead, then we'll make the transition into state 1, and we'll start playing the animation in state 1. And then if the transitions from state 1 are true, for whatever reason, we might make the transition over to state 2. Okay, so this is all very well and good in theory, but how does this help us in practice with running? Well, for example, we might want a state that says grounded. And in the grounded state, we're going to play our ground locomotion. So if we go back up to our anim graph, what is our grounded locomotion? It is basically everything here before we add our idle combat offset. There's this locomotion blend space is our grounded offset. So I'm going to cut the nodes here, go and hook up my locomotion state machine to pass in to our aim offset. Then I'm going to go into the locomotion state machine, go into the grounded state, and paste in those nodes here and connect them up to the output pin. So let's follow what's going on here at the anim graph level. First of all, we are running the animation locomotion state machine. And because I haven't hooked this up, but because the entry pin points to the grounded state, we're automatically in the grounded state. It's going to go into there, figure out, okay, we've got a blend space. We blend it using our variables. Then we output this. That becomes the output of our state machine as a whole. And then it feeds through into the combat animation, which feeds through into our death animation, which feeds into our final output. So hopefully now what we'll see when we compile it is actually nothing really has changed because there's only one state in our state machine. However, if we're jumping, then we can introduce a new state for that. We go add state, then we can have airborne as a state. And in this state, we won't be playing the same animations. We're essentially switching out those animations in the anim graph up at this level. We're saying that this node is going to switch to playing different animations when in the airborne state. So we want to go into the airborne state and make sure we have an animation selected here. So I'm going to pull off of that result pin, and I'm just going to look for a jump. And particularly, I'm going to look for the jump apex combat. Combat because that has us aiming, apex because this will be the top of our jump. And then we're going to go out of the anim graph, then we're going to go out to the locomotion level, and we'll notice that there's a problem here where there's no way for us to get to the airborne state because there isn't a transition that leads us there. So what we want to do is drag from the border of grounded on to the airborne state, and we want to double click in there because we want to create a transition here. And I'm just going to do a transition based on a variable, which we don't currently have. So if I go over to my blueprints, add a variable, and have an is airborne as a Boolean variable in here, then I can pull that over into this node editor for our grounded transition. And then we can hook that up so that what we're saying is this transition is possible when we are airborne. And then we want a converse transition that goes from airborne to grounded. And if we double click on that one, then we can put in a not node, which basically negates the Boolean. And then we can put in the is airborne Boolean as well. So that at the end, what we've got here, if we go to our anim preview editor tab over to the right, we can flip this switch and we go into that airborne state playing the airborne animation. And if we flip it again, we go back into our grounded locomotion. And you can see that all of this is going to be working with our aim pitch as well. If I move the aim pitch pointing up, then I hit our airborne, you can see we keep aiming in the direction that we should be aiming. Okay, so I've got a mini challenge for you. Apart from getting the state machine set up like this, if you haven't been following along already, what I would like you to try and do is see if you can find a way. At the moment, when we click is airborne, we get this weird glitching looping of this animation, this airborne animation. See if you can make it so that this animation doesn't loop. See if you can find your way around the anim blueprint, which can be quite hard to navigate, and see if you can find that property. Okay, welcome back. So hopefully you've gone and given this a shot. So where would we start to think about this? How would we start to navigate around this blueprint? Well, for a start, we know that this problem is coming from our locomotion state machine. So let's go in there. And we can see that the thing that is playing, the state that's currently playing, is the airborne state. So let's go into that. And you can see that the jump apex combat is just looping round and round, and it's clearly creating this problem here. So if we click on that animation and look at the details, you can see that we have got this loop animation property set. If I uncheck that and then recompile our animation blueprint, then I go and hit the is airborne, you can see it plays that jump apex just once, and then it proceeds to hold that animation until we uncheck the box, at which point it transitions back to our locomotion state machine. Let's see all of that working if we had a bit of speed, if we were moving. So here we are running. We add our is airborne. It goes into our jump apex until we are no longer airborne, at which point we transition back to being running on the ground. So that's it for this lecture. We've been introduced to a whole new concept, a lot to take in, the idea of an animation state machine. We've seen about states and how we get into them via transitions, and we've seen how that can be driven by a Boolean value to allow us to have a jump state. In the next lecture, we're going to hook this up to gameplay and refine things further.